And back now to our breaking news. CNN has obtained what is likely a key piece of evidence in the federal case against Donald Trump. It is the audio tape of a 2021 conversation about the classified documents that he was keeping.
I was just saying, because we were talking about it, and he said he wanted to attack Iran and what? These are the papers. This was done by the military, given to me.
I want to bring in CNN political analyst and senior political correspondent for the New York Times, Maggie Haberman. Maggie, you have also been reporting extensively about this tape and this conversation that went into the indictment. What was your reaction to actually hearing Trump's voice on this tape?
Well, it's interesting, Abby. One of the things that we've been hearing from people supportive of Donald Trump is that, the tape is not going to be as explosive as people thought after looking at the indictment, that the tape was, not necessarily as bad as it seemed. Trump himself told Fox News that he wasn't really, holding a document, he wasn't showing something. It certainly sounds like it on the tape that he's showing people in the room some kind of a document. You can hear papers rustling, and you could argue that papers could be anything, but they all seem to be, just again based on the reactions, looking at something. And it's interesting what they chose to put in the indictment versus not, because from that full audio you can see there are certain pieces that aren't. But he's clearly, at least appears to be clearly pointing to some kind of material, and he appears to be trying to pressure the people who are writing Mark Meadows' book and working on it to include some of this. That was my big takeaway.
Yeah, I noticed that he said, "This wins my case," which seems to tell you a lot about what he thought he was doing there. What did you take away from what Trump was trying to prove in that moment, and also what the special counsel might have been trying to demonstrate by including that specific portion of the conversation in the indictment?
Well, what I think the special counsel was trying to show was that Trump knew, he talks on that tape about how he has, essentially that he no longer has the power to declassify documents. He describes this as highly confidential, it's secret. When I was, he said, when he was president, he could declassify. Now he can't. So I think they're trying to show that he had awareness that, A, he didn't have the powers he once did, despite having claimed that he had declassified everything, and that would suggest that he knew this document was not declassified. And I think that they're trying to show that he knew exactly what he was doing. I think that, what was striking, too, about this tape, and I think there's some of this in the indictment, but he suggests, oh, look, I just found this. I just came upon this. I think they're trying to show that he was very intentional about having this material in various places. He was famous in the White House for holding meetings that, either his daughter or some other staffer would just happen to drop in and interrupt the meeting. There is a staginess about this. And again, I can't speak to what exactly the prosecutors thought they were doing, but it appears they were trying to show intentionality on a variety of aspects here.
Yeah, and he says, I have a stack of papers here, and I found this inside the stack of papers. I also wonder, Maggie, in the last couple of weeks, Trump has been trying to shift his story on this, telling Sean Hannity, oh, maybe he didn't actually have that document. This is not a new tactic for Trump, but he also knows that obviously that this tape exists in its fullness. What do you make of him trying to spin this when his legal team knows what is out there?
Look, I think that he exists in 10-minute increments of time, and I think that he just tries to survive from those 10 minutes into the next. And I think that he said what he wanted to say to Sean Hannity, regardless of the fact that not just is there this tape, Abby, but there are a bunch of people who were in that meeting who will presumably be called as witnesses by the government and asked about this meeting and asked if they saw something. So, I don't think the government was just doing this entirely on a lark. Again, we don't know everything that they have or what their plans are, but that's certainly within the realm of the possible.
Do you get the sense from talking to people in Trump's legal orbit that they have a sense of how they counter this from a defensive perspective in the courts?
I think they're going to suggest that he was simply acknowledging what reality was, but that he wasn't suggesting that. I think they're going to come up with all kinds of things that they're going to say about this tape, and I'm not sure how much of it is going to be something they believe, or how much of it is going to be, what relates to previous things Trump has said. They knew this tape existed back in March, or some of them did back in March, after it was, raised when Margot Martin, an aide to Trump, was interviewed at the grand jury, and then her tapes and so forth were subpoenaed later. But this has not been a cause of extensive alarm for some of Trump's advisors, even though others, speaking more candidly, acknowledge this is a problem.
You mentioned it hasn't been a cause of alarm for some of his advisors. What about his lawyers? I mean, several of whom have left now his legal orbit for perhaps for other reasons. But how do the lawyers who are not in the orbit anymore feel about this?
Well, without getting into specifics of just sort of narrowing down who is saying what, there are some people around Trump who are pretty candid, who have been or are around Trump, who are pretty candid that this is just not a good fact set for him. It doesn't mean that they won't find a defense for it. It doesn't mean that they won't argue, all kinds of other things at trial or even before a trial, such as, selective prosecution. They'll try to get, notes taken by one of Trump's lawyers that are in the indictment out. But the tape is a pretty specific piece of evidence, and they know it.
And of course, we learned just in the last week when discovery was released to the Trump attorneys that there were tapes, plural. And as you've reported and as CNN has reported, several of these conversations between Trump and all kinds of people who came through his world were recorded by his staff intentionally so that he could keep tabs on what was said. How big of a concern is there that this is not the only audio tape to be concerned about for Trump?
Well, look, they're going to. They have the discovery, so they now have the ability to go through it. But what has been said to me by several people is that this tape is the most damning piece of evidence that they know of existing in this case. It doesn't mean that there are not other things that are very problematic for him. I am guessing that some of these tapes are other book interviews or other interviews he sat for. This is very specific, and this was just, again, to your point about the fact that he knew his aides were his aides taped these meetings. It's not like this was a secret recording.
Separately, Maggie, there were reports today that the Secret Service agents testified in the January 6th case that's also being led by Special Counsel Jack Smith. What do we know about that?
Look, we know that, Secret Service agents have been subpoenaed in both cases, in the January 6th case and in the documents case. Secret Service agents are going to play a key role, potentially, as witnesses in January 6th, even if Jack Smith never files charges and only ends up writing a report. But they were around during key moments on January 6th, protecting Trump as, Trump, according to testimony from Cassidy Hutchinson, was in a rage, wanting to see people who were said to be armed, again, armed with sticks and not necessarily guns, but be allowed to come into his rally at the Ellipse. He wanted it to be bigger. They were right there and had a bird's eye view, and so they are potentially very important to trying to understand both the details of that day and potentially Trump's mindset.
Yeah, and of course, part of that story is also Trump wanting to go to the Capitol and to what extent he planned to do that and wanted his Secret Service agents to protect him in that journey. Maggie Haberman, always great to have you. Thank you very much for joining us.